When you imagine that scene in your head of Mary and Joseph and the baby in the stable, what do you see? A lot of the Christmas cards that I've seen lately, the scene looks something like this. We see the Holy Family, Mary and Joseph, the donkey next to them, with some visitors, a shepherd and some sheep, and usually the Magi are off in the side coming along. The stable has a few animals, but not too many. Perhaps influenced by the carol Silent Night, we imagine that it was a quiet night, a gentle, intimate little scene. Even the angels have the good taste to stay off in the hills to do their singing and not wake up the baby. Mary doesn't have to shush them or ask them to sing a lullaby instead. It was, we imagine, a quiet scene, even perhaps a silent one. But when we hear Luke's account of the story, which Ray and Jamie read to us, we're told something else. Mary and Joseph have come to a town that is so full of people that there's no room at any of the inns. Every house would have been crowded with guests and family from out of town. And families, especially extended ones, are rarely quiet, particularly when people haven't seen each other for a while. Imagine the kind of rambunctious sounds that would have been coming out of the houses as cousins who haven't seen each other for ages are running around, catching up, way past their bedtime. Adults are sitting around, sharing a drink, telling stories, catching up. Chances are that night was full of sounds of families, not at all a recipe for silence. Then there's the matter of that stable. Biblical scholars who have studied the architecture of little towns like Bethlehem say that, if you're going to have a stable, chances are that it was in a courtyard surrounded by houses. And the inn was probably somebody's house where they were renting out a few rooms. It wouldn't have been like a Super 8 motel. They didn't have those back then. This was more of a mom and pop operation where there would have been a few rooms that they were renting out. And that stable was probably in the back, pretty close to that family's house as well as the houses of others. If you think about it, if you have animals in a stable, there's no sense in having the chickens and the cows too far for the children to run over in the morning and get some eggs and carry a pail of milk back to the house. You want the stable really close. And that's what they say happened. The stables would have been in a courtyard adjacent to a whole bunch of little houses. So our image of an isolated stable doesn't actually make any sense. So why do that? Why present the stable as though it's in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a field? And why does that feel kind of quaint? Perhaps it's because here in North America, where there's a lot of land out in the country, we think of stables as something that's fairly far from the house. It could be in the middle of a lonely field here. Or maybe it's just a visual way of drawing our attention. By making the stable alone in a field, it looks like it's hard to find. That implies that the people who do find it are special, like those shepherds who were given directions by the angels, or the Magi who were following a star, or, by implication, all of us. All of us who believe that there's something in this story which speaks to us. We know who Jesus really is, and others don't, is the implication of images like this. We know where to find Jesus, even if it's far off and isolated and hard to reach. We, too, can feel special like the Magi and the shepherds, that we've managed to find this lonely manger out in the middle of nowhere. This all makes sense symbolically, but it ignores something else which is important: the importance of love. If Mary and Joseph did spend the night in a stable, they probably weren't alone. They would have been surrounded by those houses around that courtyard, which were full of families. And those neighbors would have heard that, oh, you know what? A pregnant woman is sleeping in the stable. Bethlehem is not a big town even now, and word travels fast in any small town. This was not something that would have missed people's attention. And even if somehow the grapevine hadn't communicated who was in that stable, the sounds of Mary going into labor would have. There's no mistaking a sound of a woman going into labor. And Joseph, being a man probably around 25 years old, Mary would have been a teen. Joseph was a proper Jewish man. There's no way he was going to deliver that baby. That is not in his skill set. He's a carpenter. Different skill set entirely. Rough hands, if you know what I mean. So what would Joseph have done? He would have gone to some of those neighboring houses and said, I need a midwife. I can't do this by myself. And there's no suggestion in the story that it was a miraculous birth. Miraculous conception, yes, but miraculous birth, no suggestion of that. So there's a pretty good chance that Joseph went around to those neighboring houses and found a couple of midwives. Call the midwife! Well, he did, and they came. And in as early as the 2nd century, Christians told stories about the midwives and the Magi stopping by the house of a midwife who says, oh yeah, I helped deliver that baby. Go that way. There was even something in the news this past week where in Israel they found the tomb of Salome, who is credited as being one of the assistants of the midwives who helped deliver Jesus. So the idea of midwives and the nativity scene have been going together for a very, very long time. And that may explain why Mary and Joseph don't completely freak out when a band of smelly shepherds show up out of nowhere. If any of you have been parents in a maternity ward, you know that even a few visitors can be exhausting. You're tired, the baby's tired. Every visit's a bit of an ordeal. No offense, grandparents, but it's true. If you've just given birth, then every visit's a bit of an ordeal. Few of us would throw our doors open to a gang of garage mechanics who had heard over Instagram that a baby had been born to some mother that they'd never met. Because a stable would be kind of like a parking garage or a mechanic's shop. So having complete strangers come in would have been bizarre, unless, of course, Mary had already been visited by a bunch of complete strangers, those midwives, and, of course, the innkeeper who showed her to the stable. When people help like that, it can transform any hovel into a home. It isn't the quality of the surroundings that makes a room or a house into a comfortable place. It's the love that takes up residence there. Even a night in an unheated stable can become bearable if neighbors bring in gifts and some potluck food and some blankets and stuff that you need. Many of us remember our first apartments when we moved away from home with great fondness. Not because they were nice apartments. If you think about the very first place you lived in, whether it was a room in residence or perhaps, the very first place you rented when you got your first job, chances are the furniture didn't match, the color decor didn't matter. You had all sorts of, terrible posters on the wall that you're, afraid to admit to now, but that's what you thought was cool then. Scorched knives in the drawer that you didn't want to show the parents. Maybe a few cases of beer that you threw a blanket over should anybody visit. Rarely the kind of decorating that would make it into a Martha Stewart magazine spread. But if we remember our first apartments and our first residence rooms with fondness, it's not because of the quality of the decor. It's because of the fun that we had there and the loving relationships that we had there. The joy of being with people who loved us and who we loved back. And often the roommates we have in those first apartments and residence rooms become friends who last for decades afterwards. It's the quality of the company that makes a place warm. Even a stable can become a temporary home if visitors show love and provide help. And that means that even when love is absent, then even the most expensive home or condo can feel empty. I know we know deep down that the Christmas story is about people coming together to transform hovels into homes. That's why we find it so charming that this family, exhausted from travel and a birth, welcomed strangers from the fields from the east. The Magi who came so far. People coming together in a spirit of hospitality and togetherness is what makes slums and refugee camps and favelas not just bearable, but places that people call home. They may not want to live there forever. But on the news, have you ever noticed that if there's a murder in a poor neighborhood, there's always some moms who stand up and say, "This isn't what our neighborhood's about." Whether it's Regent Park or some other housing place or housing authority, there's communities in all of those places because love takes root where people care for each other, no matter how much money they're spending in rent. When Jesus was born, the neighbors and strangers came to help. Some likely brought towels and basins of warm water for the birth. Others brought expensive gifts like gold and frankincense and myrrh. The shepherds brought news of an angelic chorus announcing this most extraordinary thing about this baby. Jesus was surrounded by people who loved and adored him as a baby and as a Messiah. And on this cold Christmas Eve, we are reminded that love is what matters most. Hospitality is love in action, tangible love, maybe even especially for strangers. A lesson our city could consider carefully when our shelters are full and people are turned away every night. Tents are taken away even though the city can't give them anywhere else to go. And so they end up all night on the TTC trying to stay warm. That innkeeper knew nothing about Mary and Joseph when he or she offered them that place in the stable. There was no means test, didn't ask whether they had a certain income or a job. There was no question about references. None of that mattered. Hospitality is love expressed in blankets and beds, food, and a roof overhead. It isn't expensive, but it is priceless. As we celebrate Christmas this year, let's remember that hospitality that the innkeeper offered to a pair of strangers on their night of need. God showed us that even a night spent in a smelly stable can become a place of intimacy and care if it's heated with love, even from strangers. No one that night came to hear baby Jesus preach or work miracles. But nonetheless, neighbors and strangers gathered to help. It was the overture of the theme that Jesus would develop for the rest of his life. That love matters more than wealth. That wealth shared creates a home in this world as well as in the next. So let us make room in the inn of our hearts for each other, knowing that when we do, Christ will always be present, even when he's silent. Amen.